From 1700 to 1850, food changes in a tremendous way. The kind of cooking, the techniques, and even the ingredients. You see these changes showing up in baking and specifically in the pinnacle of the baking art, and that is cakes. We have a special guest today. We have Justine Rayfield from the Early American YouTube channel, and she's going to help me investigate these two cakes that we have to experiment with today.
I'm so excited and honored to be here, John. Thank you so much. I heard there was cake. I came all the way from Missouri for this cake. And the focus of my channel is the early 1800s. And as you know, the 1800s saw an explosion in different and new processes for baking, and that included new leavening agents. Baking soda became more popular, especially as we get into the 1820s, and then we eventually get baking powder.
Now, some people might be confused that the two channels that we have here, the Townsends channel and Early American, are covering exactly the same time period, when in fact we actually are a little bit different. We tend to, here on the Townsends channel, cover between 1700 and 1800. We will stray into earlier recipes to help understand the 18th century recipes, and at times we will creep into the 19th century, into say 1820 occasionally when we're looking at our recipes.
My period of focus is the federal era, the first half of the 1800s especially, but I really am focused on about 1790 to 1830, and there was a huge change in the culinary world from the colonial era through the federal time period.
As we go from the 1700s into the 1800s, we are seeing these massive changes, not just in cooking, but in the way people are dressing, in their political thought, in their scientific thought. They're even trying to figure out what's happening in the leavening of a cake. Specifically, what really is yeast? Great question. They had no idea in the 18th century what yeast was and why it did what it did. But later on in the early 19th century, they discover the actual action that's happening, that it's alive and it's creating the leavening. Our example here is the great cake. And the leavening technique goes through a couple of different changes in our time period. They start off early on using yeast to leaven the cake. And then in the middle of the 18th century, they really transition to using egg whites. They whip air into egg whites to use it to leaven the cakes. And then in the early 19th century, they discover the chemical leavening, which creates a cake which is much more like the cake we experience today, light and fluffy, totally different than the cakes that were made with the egg whites or with the yeast. Today, Justine and I are going to be baking two different cakes. I'm going to be working on this early 18th century cake using yeast. And then we have a very similar recipe, and Justine is going to be making a cake with baking soda, which is a much later discovery.
In my time period, the early 1800s, they were still baking cakes with yeast. It works, and they were familiar with it. Now, baking soda was technically invented in the 1790s, but it didn't start creeping into people's kitchens, maybe more so until the 1820s, the 1830s. But we found one that we are going to make today, cut into it, and see if there is a difference between the two cakes. I'm super excited to make this today because, to be frank, it is a little easier than what yours is going to be. Mine is leavened with baking soda. This is a soda cake, and the receipt is from 1840.
My much more primitive cake is from 1725, and it uses yeast as its leavener. It's really hearkening back to cakes of 50 and 100 years before. My recipe today is from Court Cookery by Smith, and this is from 1725, although it dates earlier than that. This is just a later edition of it. It's called To Make a Very Good Batter Cake, and here's the recipe. Take 3 pounds of currants, 5 pounds of flour, an ounce of cloves and mace, a little beaten cinnamon, half an ounce of nutmegs, half a pound of sugar, 3/4 of a pound of citron, lemon, and orange peel candied, half a pint of sack, a little honey water, a quart of ale yeast, a quart of cream, a pound and 3/4 of butter melted therein. Mix it together on a board and lay it before the fire to rise. Then work it up, put it in a hoop with paper floured at the bottom. and so bake it. Take care not to burn it. Now, I mentioned earlier that this is a primitive recipe. Now, it's primitive only in its leavening technique here. It is a very expensive cake. This is a type of grape cake, and you can tell it because it's 5 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of currants. This is going to be, if we baked it like the recipe is, it would be a 10 or 12 or 15 pound cake. Very difficult to bake, and we are going to make a smaller version of that. Now, it's also a very expensive cake. This has lots of spices. It has lots of expensive raisins and currants in it. So this is primitive only in its leavening, which is the yeast here. This recipe is huge, so let's make it much smaller. We're gonna make it about 1/5 of the size of the original one, and that will work out very well. We have 1 pound of flour that I'm going to start off with, and we're gonna mix that with 1 pound of raisins and currants, or Zante raisins, basically a mix of small and large raisins. And we're gonna put in now all our seasoning, and this one uses cinnamon, it uses cloves and nutmeg and mace. So that's a lot of seasoning. I've just got a little bit of each here, and we're gonna put in along with the sugar. They called for 1/2 pound. That means we need something like 1/8 of a pound of sugar. This also has, as well as the raisins, it's got all these candied peels. Now this is where the bulk of the sugar really is in these candied peels. And I don't have citron, but I do have lemon peel and orange peel. I've got a little bit of wine here. They call for sack. That's just basically like a sherry cooking wine. We're gonna put that in along with yeast. Now, yeast is totally different today than it is in the 18th century. They're using barm or liquid yeast they're getting from the brewer. Of course, we don't have that today. We have the yeast that we get in packages. You can just mix that up with a little bit of water. This, in a modern sense, would take probably the classic 1 packet of yeast, maybe 1/2 packet, depending on what you're using here. We also have cream. Again, we want a small portion of this. They're calling for 1/4. We need 1/4 of that. Butter. They're almost using 2 pounds of butter, so we've got about 1/2 pound of butter melted. Now we're just gonna mix this all together and then set it aside for that yeast to rise. After an hour of rising, this looks pretty good. I'm gonna go ahead and put it into our form here. So I've got a wooden hoop. I have gone ahead and put greased paper or buttered paper into the form so that this will release. If I didn't use that, we might not be able to get it out of this form. You'll find those directions in 18th century cookbooks. The directions for this, once you take it out of the form and possibly, put icing on it or something, they say to flip it over. And you can definitely tell how the top of this is not going to look great, but the bottom will be nice and flat. So perfect for our display cake.
My cake today looks a little bit different. It is called a soda cake, and it comes from a new system of domestic cookery. This is the 1840 edition, but this book was in use many decades before this. But the 1840 edition is very interesting because by this point now we have something called baking soda, something that's still in use today. Some people call it sodium bicarbonate. This receipt was originally published in London, and it's going to be much easier to put together than the earlier yeast-based cakes, because with yeast-based cakes, you don't have to let it rise twice. This, you just add the soda and it's ready to bake. Super excited about that. The receipt reads as such: 1 pound of flour, 1 dram of soda, 1/2 pound of sugar, ditto of currants, and 1/4 pound of butter. Mix the soda with the flour, then rub in the butter, after which add the sugar and the currants and a pint of milk. Put it into the oven immediately. Now we're given another version which says a variety may be given by substituting 1/4 pound of lemon, orange, and citron candied and 1 ounce of pounded sweet almonds for the currants, but in that case the cake will require rather more soda. So I thought about the last sentence in this receipt for a while. Why is it saying that in that case the cake will require rather more soda if I reduce how many currants are in this cake? The main acid that's in this cake is coming from these dried currants. And by the way, current cakes were as generic as chocolate and vanilla cakes are today. So I think that when you reduce the amount of currants that's in the final cake, you're also reducing the amount of naturally occurring acid, and we need that acid to react with the baking soda in order to create that leavening. To start with this receipt, it's instructing us to mix the flour with the baking soda and then to rub in the butter, which sounds very similar to how you make most pie crust today. It's a little unusual for a cake receipt, but let's just try it out. We're now going to add the acid to our cake, which is going to react with the baking soda. We have the milk, the dried currants, and the sugar as well. We're going to mix that all together until we have something that resembles a cake batter. Now the receipt does not mention how we are supposed to bake it. Classic for these 200-plus-year-old receipts. We could put it in a very well greased cake dish, or we could bake it in a cake hoop that is lined with paper so that it's easy to take out. I think I'm gonna go with the cake hoop. This batter is looking beautiful. It's exactly where we want it to be. Now, I have to bake it. Problem is, like a lot of these old receipts, it does not tell you what temperature to bake it at and how long to bake it at. But just based off of my previous experience with cakes like this, I'm gonna go about 350-ish degrees, 40 to 50 minutes will probably do it.
Our cakes are out of the oven and I let them cool and pop them out of their rings. Sometimes they're a little tight, but they will come right out of there and peel the paper off. That should come off very simply if you've buttered it. And now we get a chance to try them out to find out what the real differences are in taste and texture and all that.
Well, it smells absolutely amazing in here, so of course, coincidentally, that's when my husband, Ron Rayfield, decided to wander his way into this kitchen. This man knows food. He's been eating 3 times a day since he was born. It was a long time ago. So we are going to try these cakes and see how they turned out.
This is the older style, the 1725. It is chock full of, and I gave them just giant pieces, chock full of spices. And you know, you can just smell the spices. You get, it's lots of fruit. We think of cakes and we think of light and fluffy birthday cakes and all that. These are fruit cakes, basically.
A big emphasis on fruit. Mm-hmm. Every bite has multiple pieces of fruit in it.
But it's not very sweet.
No, it's not.
Even with all that fruit in it, there's not that much sugar in it. So let's go ahead and try out Justine's cake here. And you can tell, even when you rip it, just how much more classic cake texture it is. It's not nearly as crumbly.
Now, I might be a little biased because I made this cake, but I will say already that it bears a much stronger resemblance to a cake that you would find in the 21st century, as far as the taste and the texture.
Right. If you took the raisins out, and this would be just like a standard...
Yeah, a standard plain cake. Mm-hmm. It has a lovely bounce to it. It's not crumbly like the earlier cake. It's holding together very well. Right. That makes it more moist.
I want to thank Justine and Ronnie for coming all the way from Missouri to the kitchen to try out these recipes, to experiment with us so that we can figure out exactly the differences in these kinds of cakes.
It was a pleasure. We had a lot of fun.
A lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Make sure to check out their YouTube channels, both Early American and Frontier Patriot. I'm sure you will enjoy them.
Now, where's the milk?